Welcome everybody to this emergency briefing on the Operation Swords of Iron, as it is being called now. A major conflict erupted in Israel on Saturday in the holiday of Simchat Torah, when there was a massive infiltration across Israel's southern border from Gaza into numerous Jewish communities in southern Israel. Over 1,000 Jews killed, potentially, according to some reports. Over 2,600 injured, as many as 150 or more kidnapped, with the government saying that at least 100 are hostages now taken back into the Gaza Strip. We are trying to assess what's happening in real time. Israel has started its counterattack. It's mobilized over 300,000 soldiers, including active soldiers and reservists. And so without further ado, I want to take you into the whole military aspect of what is happening. My name's Alex Traiman. I'm the CEO and Jerusalem Bureau Chief of Jewish News Syndicate, and I am joined by my fantastic colleague, Yaakov Lappin, who is the military correspondent for JNS. Yaakov, tell us, if you can, what's the situation now?
The situation now is, we're a couple of days after Israel's darkest day, the most traumatic and I believe multi-generational event that we will be feeling for many, many years to come, at least on the level of the Yom Kippur War, but probably even more. Without getting into the multiple systemic failures that enabled this mass slaughter to take place, because it's simply too soon to get into those details, and we're at the beginning of a war. What's happening on the military front is that the IDF is at the very end of completing the first stage of its response, and that is taking back control of southern Israel, of the Gaza envelope. It has mobilized approximately 4 divisions, which is a very large number of military personnel to southern Israel. Some of those forces, especially the special forces, have been designated with the task of making sure that the breaches in the security fence have been covered with tanks, with air cover. There's approximately 20 of those breaches. Some of them have been allocated to cleansing the remaining areas. As of this morning, Israel time, there were about 7 to 8 areas that still had Hamas murder squads in them. Those areas have since, in recent hours, been cleansed, and terrorists killed. Hundreds of terrorists have been killed on Israeli territory. And so that stage is coming to an end, and we're seeing the massing of very large numbers of armor, infantry, artillery units. They're all massing staging areas along the Gazan border, waiting for the order from the security cabinet to move in, which will surely come. In the air, we're seeing massive, really unprecedented air campaigns targeting every known Hamas target in the target bank. You know what they call the target bank? There are thousands of these targets. We're seeing entire neighborhoods essentially leveled. But these are not just neighborhoods. These are places where Hamas has established capabilities, offensive capabilities, command and control, places where they have rocket firing systems, where they plan their ground assaults, their war crimes against Israeli civilians. And of course, they entrench themselves in the middle of Gaza's civilian neighborhood and use all of Gaza as a mass human shielding cover. And so obviously there's going to be a lot of devastation coming Gaza's way. And what we're seeing in terms of the air power is just the start. So that essentially is where things stand. I think we're at the end of what we could call the first stage of this military operation, and I think the second stage is going to be that ground operation. They're getting into this, what we can call a defensive posture, reasserting control, and then moving into offense, shifting into offense. And at the same time, there's also a significant mobilization to the north. Lots of armored and infantry and artillery units have moved up to the north, because it's clear that the tension with Hezbollah is extremely high. I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit later in this webinar. We don't know where that front is going. Will it stay quiet or not? We simply don't know. So the IDF is preparing for a multi-front reality. But as of now, as at the time of us having this conversation, the focus is on the Gaza Strip.
Right. So tell me, why is it that the call up or the first phase has taken so long? Right. We're only now starting to see in the last several hours, massive airstrikes, but it's been close to 72 hours, I guess, since the breach of the border on Saturday morning. Well, what's taken so long?
Well, clearly, on the first day, there was just multiple systemic failures. I won't go into the details because they're still emerging, but, we have an intelligence failure. We have an operational readiness failure. We have a deployment failure. Forces were sent home for the holiday. Forces were deployed in other arenas. Israel was caught completely off guard. And so when it came time to respond and wake up, the military system, that took time. Now, what added more time to that response is the fact that the entire battle arena was in a civilian ecosystem. What that means is that the IDF didn't want to just sweep through rapidly the Gaza envelope area in Israel. They wanted to surgically go, house to house, rescue as many lives as possible. That was the goal. We had families that were held hostage in their homes. We had, kibbutz dining centers that turned into hostage centers. And these Hamas death squads were hiding all over the place. Some of them were with Israeli civilians. Some of them were just out in the field looking for targets. And the IDF really wanted to eliminate them while saving as many Israeli lives as it could. And that's the second reason why this took a long time, and even longer than what the IDF itself had.
Can you tell me a little bit about how many rockets have been fired at Israeli population centers over the last 3 days?
Yeah, so I mean, the count is constantly going up, but it's well over 5,000 now, and we're looking at probably coming up to 6,000. The last update that I had was several hours ago, and by then it was over 5,500. Enormous barrages. Hamas is firing everything it has. At the beginning of this attack, the rocket fire was essentially serving as a cover for the ground assault. So this was a combined Hamas ground and air assault. The rocket arsenal is really the quote-unquote Air Force of Hamas. They don't have planes, but they have rockets, and they can direct them at Israeli cities. And that's what they do. So in the first phase, they use that as a cover. And in the second, as the scale of and scope of this atrocity became clear, they continued the barrages in order to keep up the pressure on Israel. And they're looking for this victory picture. And these rocket barrages are part of that. So we have many, many thousands. Hamas's full arsenal is being deployed here.
Is there an assessment? Is there an assessment of how large the Hamas rocket arsenal is?
It's an interesting question because while approximately up until say 3 years ago, there were assessments after 2020, the IDF stopped sharing its assessment of Hamas's arsenal for operational reasons. So we could estimate, maybe it was 15,000 rockets, maybe it was 12,000. The number is not fully clear, but it's a sizable arsenal, and we're just carry on building more and more. There's sprawling arms industry in the Gaza Strip, which is Iranian funded. Know how to build these rockets comes from Iran, and the local production capability is one that Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad set up. So they churn out thousands of these rockets, every year.
Right. Can you tell me a little bit about Iron Dome? Obviously, most of these rockets are being shot out of the sky. There have been some direct hits. There was a direct hit today in Beitar. Yesterday, there was a direct hit on a hospital in Ashkelon. There was a hit in a building in Bnei Brak. But, how much Iron Dome does Israel have? How effective is it at shooting down the rockets? And is there the possibility that the Iron Dome batteries could either get overrun or run out?
Right. So Iron Dome, usually its efficiency rate is approximately 90%. Sometimes it goes higher than that. It can get up to 95%. I mean, when people hear that statistic, they're rightly very impressed. That's a world-leading phenomenal air defense system that has no equivalent anywhere in the world. But even if we're looking at 90%, that still means, and we have to keep this in mind, that on average, out of every 100 rockets, 10 are going to get through. And that's what we're seeing. So if you saturate the system, saturate Israel's airspace, minority of those rockets will get through. And those are the ones we are hearing about, unfortunately. The system appears to be performing perfectly fine. In terms of stockpiling interceptors, well, there's a very large stockpile of those Tamil interceptors. Some of those interceptors are guided by advanced cameras, electro-optic systems, how they call it in military jargon. And some of those are radar-guided interceptors. And the system chooses which one to fire, uses artificial intelligence to do that. And it's a very advanced system. It's functioning and it's preventing mass carnage, across the streets.
Is there a fear that at some point it can run out? I mean, we've heard in the past after conflict that Israel is appealing to the United States in order to get more Iron Dome funding to replenish the Iron Dome. Is there the assessment that however many rockets that Hamas may have, that Israel has enough Iron Dome to keep up?
So, the war planners and the engineers and the people from Rafael that make Iron Dome and the Israeli Air Force Air Defense Array, when they sit down and plan for future escalations, what they do is they look at Hamas's rocket arsenal. This is one of the reasons why, we've probably stopped hearing exact estimates of that arsenal. And they stock up on interceptors to enable Israel to fight a lengthy war. So we don't have the number of interceptors. That's not in the public domain. It's a classified figure. But what we do know is that there's lots and lots and lots of them, and that they were being mass-produced in the years that led up to this escalation.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and take a question also from the field. And by the way, people can ask questions in the Q&A portion of the Zoom, and we'll try to get to some of those questions as they come up. But question is, how if Israel has an assessment of how many rockets Hamas actually has, how is it that Israel's permitted Hamas to accumulate all of these rockets if they have that intelligence?
It's a very good question, and it actually comes to the heart of, I think, of what has changed, what this war has changed. Up until now, the dominant concept in the Israeli defense establishment and in successive Israeli governments has been that Hamas can be contained. Now, what that means is that there was some kind of trade-off. The idea was, okay, Israel will not directly govern the Gaza Strip and its 2.2 million Palestinians. They will not have to deal with that enormous challenge. And in exchange for relinquishing that burden, Hamas was allowed to act as both the regime and to have full capability of mass producing these rockets. Now, the only way you can really stop an enemy from producing weapons in a major way, right, is to control the territory. There's no other way. So if we look at Judea and Samaria, sure, we saw, a few amateurish rockets, and we have to keep an eye out on that threat, but they don't have that arsenal because the IDF is in the ground every single day, conducting raids, taking down rocket-making labs, arresting operatives, and just not letting this monstrous arsenal take shape. And that's exactly what has not been happening in the Gaza Strip. And so every year that Israel basically agreed to this equation, Hamas was able to build its arsenal. And the thing that I would add is that what broke this is actually not the rocket arsenal, because Iron Dome did appear to prove itself, but it was Hamas's identification with Iranian help, its ability to raid Israel from the ground, to send these murder squads over the fence and barrier, the new barrier, the wall that Israel spent billions investing in, including an underground component against tunnels, right, and sending them over it with powered gliders and landing at beach in Zikim, this sort of 3-domain attack. They figured out how to overcome those systems, and the rocket ended up being sort of a supporting actor, if you will.
Well, you mentioned that you mentioned that you don't want to get too far into the security and intelligence failures, just really because it's not the time for that, and there's a lot of action taking place. But can you relate a little bit to how sophisticated the Gaza border actually is? What are the components there? I mean, I've toured the border, and the
Sure.
IDF was always boasting, how secure that area is. So can you tell us a little bit about what that looks like, the border?
Yeah, and it's being compared to the Maginot Line in Europe, but the border was supposed to be a world-leading barrier that was completely networked with sensors, radars, alert systems that would detect underground infiltration attempts by the tunnels, overground infiltration attempts, with radars and cameras and remote control machine guns that were placed on that barrier. And really, it was seen as almost an impenetrable barrier. And in reality, the extremely painful awakening that we have all received now is that that concept has failed, and the technology, even though alerts were issued, Hamas was able to destroy some of the sensors by sending drones with explosives directly at them. And also, even if some of the sensors worked, if you don't have enough forces on the ground, then it's like being in a boxing ring and seeing your opponents but having no hands to respond.
Right.
To put it in layman's terms, sensors are designed to activate forces. They're supposed to guide firepower and the forces. But if you don't have forces, then the sensors are not going to help.
Yeah, you mentioned that there were drones being used, to bomb some of the surveillance towers, and we've seen videos of that going on social media and elsewhere. But really, the infiltration, paragliders we're talking about tractors coming up to the fence and making breaches of the fence. Seems like it was a pretty low tech infiltration through a very high tech border.
That's right. They went with low tech, but because it was combined, because they had kept it secret, and because our intelligence failed to detect the plot, the operational readiness was completely lacking. And so the system was overwhelmed and the system crashed. And that led to a successive crash of other systems as well in the south. And the horrific, unimaginable scenes are what followed.
So, hundreds of terrorists stormed the border. They were in Israeli communities as far as 15 miles away from the border. In some cases, terrorists were moving for hours, were able to bring over 100 hostages back across the border without even being intercepted. We're only now something like 48 hours after the battle started, being told that the South is secure. Have all the terrorists been apprehended in the country that are still left?
I can't say that all of them have, but it seems like the vast majority have. We can divide them into two. There is the terrorists that were there from the beginning of this assault, and those terrorists, after 72 hours, if they're not going to eat or drink or sleep, they are going to either die out in the field, or they're going to try and launch a last-minute attack before they're unable to continue to function. I think that's what we're seeing, those cleanup operations, locating them, because there's only so long people can be in a field without food or water or sleep. And there are also, unfortunately, there's been a trickle of murder squads, new ones that were coming in, at least as of last night. And as far as I understand, all of those have now been located and destroyed. So it seems like now it's happened approximately 24 hours after the IDF had initially assessed that it would be able to do this, but it now has reached the point where it really does have control back over that area. There's no 100%. This whole kind of warfare, I think we should note, it's not a military on a classic military war. This is a military that's facing these highly decentralized murder squads. They can be hiding anywhere. And it's much harder to find them. I call it, the invisible enemy, because you don't see a row of tanks, and that's easy to see with your eyes and to target. You're talking about essentially a commando murder squad, and people who are heavily armed but can easily move around, hide out in the field, and difficult spots, especially when the previous system has collapsed.
Right. It's an asymmetric battle taking place. So you talked a little bit about now being the end, or towards the end, of what you call phase one. Can you tell us a little bit about what the objectives of the phase one were and what we've seen targeted inside Gaza through this massive barrage of Israeli airstrikes?
Yeah. So phase one was really about taking back control of the south, entering this defensive posture, reinstating Israeli security and sovereignty over the south, and cleansing out the last of those murder squads that we were talking about. The air operation is occurring throughout. It's going to be something that runs alongside phase one and two, and the air operation is about causing as much damage to Hamas's capabilities as possible. And I think it's important to understand the logic of this kind of air campaign is very, very different from the logic of previous air campaigns. Hamas's wars with Israel up until now, escalations. During those escalations, Israel's goal was to reestablish deterrence, not to destroy Hamas. And, if we look at the cabinet's own statements that they released yesterday, the goal is not deterrence. The goal is not to reestablish deterrence against Hamas. The goal is to destroy Hamas's military and governing capabilities. That's the quote that came out of the cabinet meeting after it convened yesterday. And the air campaign is a reflection of that goal. So the scope of munitions that have been dropped is far greater than ever before. The targeting is far wider. The Israeli Air Force makes every effort to comply with international law, and it will continue to do that always. But the scope of the bombing is very different. What are they going after? They're going after every known target. So that would be rocket launchers, command and control, operatives, bunkers, infrastructure, staging areas. Bet Hanun in the north, and Shajaiya, which has always been a Hamas staging area, which is in the eastern part of Gaza City. Multi-story buildings are just coming down one after the other. These are all Hamas structures, every single one of them. And we've seen tens of thousands, I think it's up to about 80,000, 75,000 Gazans adhering to IDF calls to evacuate their homes because their homes are in the middle of Hamas operational centers and moving. They've been told to, either go north or east or west or south. And then we've seen many, many Gazans adhere to those calls, understanding that, they're in a completely different situation that their regime has dragged them into. So again, this is just the start. I think what's going to happen now, or in the next couple of days after all of these targets have been exhausted, is that the Air Force will switch to this second mode, which is gathering real-time intelligence. You have a target sort of database that you can just go after those targets, and you don't require any more information because you already know where they are. And then you do have to see what's going on in those areas before you strike, but you know where the targets are. And then there's the real time, the new targets. So the Israeli Air Force is going to also be using its fleets of drones and other manned aircraft and other kinds of sensors to constantly gather new information on Hamas's targets, new targets, and then strike and act on that intelligence. And this is all before the ground invasion begins.
Is Israel targeting Hamas leaders for targeted assassinations? And also, there's been many pictures over the years of Hamas leaders having gigantic villas on the Gaza Strip, many of them near the sea, like incredible beachfront property. Is Israel taking all that out? Is it targeting Hamas's top leadership?
Absolutely, the top leadership is on the target list. Yehia Sinwar, the head of Hamas, and Mohammed Dif, who is the commander of the military wing. These are all clearly targets, but because they had the element of surprise, the advantage, they obviously put themselves deep underground in bunkers, and it's going to be much more difficult to get at them from the air. It's much more likely that ground forces will be required to get Hamas's senior leadership. Absolutely, they're targets, there's no question in my mind. And maybe not only them, Hamas also has overseas personnel. There's Uli, who's based in Lebanon, who runs an entire headquarters that orchestrates terrorism in Judea and Samaria. And there is Hania, who has fancy villas in Qatar and other places. I think all of these people are going to be on Israel's list, although targeting abroad is a different story. But I wouldn't be surprised if when they travel, they would also be targeted at certain locations. But certainly within the Gaza Strip, Hamas's leadership particularly its military leadership, all absolutely on Israel's target list, and their homes, some of them have already been struck. I read that Yehi Sinwar's home has been struck. I don't think that's going to make a great impression on him, by the way, but absolutely, their homes, their properties, anything linked to Hamas's military wing, anything at all, is going to be a target.
We know that basically Israel's entire military, including active soldiers and reservists, have been called up, about 300,000 people, according to what I've read. You seem to be certain that a ground incursion is coming into Gaza. First question, even before we get to the ground incursion, is if Israel's able to do so much targeting from the air and inflict so much damage with the technological superiority that the Air Force provides, do we even want to be sending our soldiers, who are husbands, fathers, sons, daughters, into the booby-trapped Gaza Strip? Is that even necessary?
And it's a very good question. It's an important question. If you ask me, my private, personal opinion is that there's simply no choice, because we have gone so far beyond the red line, and so far beyond the scope of just another escalation. We're dealing with 700 to 800, or as you said, even more possibly, Israelis who have been murdered in the most brutal and callous manner. Anything short of the destruction of Hamas's capabilities would send, I think, essentially, a message of such weakness to Israel's other adversaries. It would guarantee that others would get involved in this attack. So in order for Israel to restore its ability to be a continuous strategic power in this region and a functioning state, it's going to have to, in my opinion, destroy the entity that launched this massacre. And you cannot destroy Hamas from the air. Wars cannot be won from the air. As sophisticated and powerful as air power is, without going into those streets and taking apart Hamas's infrastructure, much of which is underground, and holding that territory, it's not possible to destroy their capabilities. They will always just recover.
I want to talk a little bit about what it would mean if Hamas was taken out in a minute. But first, I want to talk about a ground incursion. Does Israel have the operational battle plans in place? Has it been preparing for a ground incursion? Are the soldiers and the commanders ready for a ground incursion? And what does a ground incursion look like?
So, even now as we speak, we have major generals fighting with the rank and file, active service infantry on the ground in southern Israel, taking those last remaining areas away from the Hamas murder squads. I think the motivation in Israel has never been higher for a ground invasion. So in terms of motivation and fighting spirit, it couldn't be higher. I'm sure that reservist ranks are going to be overflowing. They'll have too many people volunteering. In terms of capabilities and war planning, yeah, and that's absolutely, the appropriate question, Alex. From what I've seen, over the past decade, the IDF Southern Command and the General Staff and the military intelligence has built extremely detailed ground offensive plans. Those plans involve moving heavy armor, infantry, and artillery into Gaza, taking control of it systematically. There are various versions of these plans. And the cabinet would receive the menu list, so to speak, and it would choose the scope of the invasion, and everything would be aligned with the objectives. But if we're talking about what I believe is going to be the objective, which is the systematic destruction of Hamas's capabilities and governing powers, that will require the maximal taking of the Gaza Strip from north to south, from the Israeli border to the coast, dividing it up into sub-arenas, and you'll get brigades and battalions with very, very detailed battle plans, where they need to go, who they need to destroy, how to communicate with Gazan civilians, how to evacuate them. It's going to be a very messy affair. It's going to be a painful affair, as you've alluded to. It will be costly. Israel will pay a heavy cost for a ground invasion in a crowded, asymmetric arena like the Gaza Strip. There's little doubt about that. But it seems clear to me that the country has very little choice but to proceed with that option following.
How long could something like that take?
So that is a key question. And that really depends on, again, the objectives. But from what I can see, judging by, say, the cabinet statement that was released last night, the initial phase of the ground invasion would have to go on for at least a number of months. I cannot envisage an operation that would last 2 weeks, and 3 weeks, and then they withdraw, and Hamas would be right back where it started within a couple of years. If the idea is to reshape the Middle East, as the country's leaders are talking about now, that would require a long-term Israeli presence in the Gaza Strip. It could, Alex, end up being years. The presence could end up being years, but this phase of cleansing out the Gaza Strip will last at least months. We can look at precedents, the Second Intifada, when Judea and Samaria became a hornet's nest, suicide bomb factories, and Israel launched Operation Defensive Shield in 2002, went back into those Palestinian city centers, and the Kasbot, and Jenin, and Nablus, etc. That actually took 3 years. That operation took 3 years before the security situation came back under control. And I think the Gaza Strip is in that league. So I don't know if it's months or it's going to be years, but it'll be a long, long affair, and we're at the start of a completely new era in our country and regional history.
In the short term, can you tell me what the presence of Israeli hostages in the Gaza Strip, what impact that plays on the ground incursion? Does that create further incentives or limitations for what the IDF is willing to do? Is the rescue of those hostages the number one priority, or one of the top priorities of any one of these operational battle plans? And also, are the tunnels, that we've heard have been developed for so long, are these places where they think that the hostages may be kept, well underground, things like that?
Right. So the hostages is a horrific dilemma, absolutely horrific. And the problem is that, any negotiations that start for them could be used by Hamas, not to secure the release of their prisoners as, maybe they initially had intended, but rather to slow down Israel's momentum. That could be Hamas's goal. I don't know, but I'm looking at it from their perspective. They certainly would not want, I think, Israel's tanks and infantry moving into their base and taking it away from them. And if they enter into a lengthy, negotiations, then they could try and slow down Israel's momentum and essentially freeze the ground invasion. And if that's Hamas's, goal, that I don't think Israel has any intention of allowing that to happen. So it's a horrific dilemma. It's absolutely horrific. I don't know what the cabinet will decide. Will it try to launch rescue operations that could be ill-fated or could be successful? We don't know. It's extremely difficult operationally. I have no doubt that, special forces and the Shin Bet Intelligence Agency and other members of the intelligence community are trying to figure out where those hostages are and what can be done to help them. And we're hearing various voices. We heard the former national security advisor, Yaakov Amidro. He was saying yesterday that, in his opinion, what Israel should do is say, there are no negotiations for these hostages, as painful as that is. We're simply going to, continue this operation until they're released, until Hamas releases them. And that's assuming that Hamas is even, functional in a number of months.
Sure. I mean, if you said that to Hamas, if the goal is actually to take Hamas out as an entity and no longer let it govern, so why would they release hostages?
Exactly. That's exactly it. Like, running a negotiations with somebody who you're determined to eliminate as an entity is one of the paradoxes, I think, of this new era that we're entering into. And old language, negotiations, deterrence, containment, these are remnants, I think, of the previous era, and we appear to be leaving that. So unless the cabinet chooses a smaller target, and unless it decides to maybe leave some part of Hamas, in existence, which again I doubt, but we don't know. The way for Israel to proceed is to continue its operations, irrespective of the horrific and tragic kidnapping of so many of its citizens.
When do you think that a ground incursion could be launched? How soon?
It could be launched at any moment. It could happen tonight. It could happen tomorrow. I think that time is not on Israel's side. The international community. I've been here stranded in London. Couldn't get my flight back to Israel, even though I tried. So I'm seeing, what the international community, the atmosphere here is. And I've never seen a bigger outpouring for the plight of Israeli civilians. The government here rejects the Israeli flag, and the international press front page across the board is in shock and mourning, and the mask of Hamas has come off. As the IDF spokesperson said yesterday, this is more brutal than ISIS, or as brutal. I don't know if you can be more brutal than ISIS, but the world sees who Hamas is. So the moment for Israel to reshape the region is now. And if it doesn't take this opportunity, then who knows, when the next one will arrive. And so this is a terrible dilemma, Alex. I couldn't fathom, being in the cabinet. I'll tell you honestly, I just having to face this dilemma, knowing those people are there, is the most heartbreaking nightmare scenario that we could imagine. And I don't envy the security cabinet for a moment. It's an absolutely horrific dilemma, but at the end of it, decision will have to be made.
You've mentioned some issues which maybe we'll get to a little bit later if there's time, about who governs the Gaza Strip if Hamas isn't there. I don't want to get into that right now because we're still in the early days of a conflict of which we don't even really. Several of the stages haven't even begun yet. We don't know what the fronts are going to be, so I think it's a little early to talk about what happens in the aftermath of an incursion or battle plan. There's also, you mentioned international support. Obviously, it's easy to get the support of the international community when Israel gets attacked on a holy day and over 1,000 people potentially are killed and 100+ hostages are taken, and there's a massacre at a music festival in the south. It's very easy to understand that the international community would be in Israel in that moment, but tomorrow is no longer going to be that moment, and by the morning, I'm certain that we are going to have pictures and figures coming out of Gaza of the number of Gazans displaced, the nature of the humanitarian crisis that's being created there, the number of Gazan civilians and militants that are killed, and just based on what I've seen in terms of the pictures and the videos coming out of Gaza, you'd have to imagine that within 24 hours from now, there might be way more Gazans dead than there were Israelis killed in the initial attack. So you'd have to imagine that at a certain point, the international community is going to say, hey, we were with you when you were the victim, but now you're the aggressor. So, in the asymmetric battle, Israel is clearly the more powerful force with the greater technology, with many more soldiers, potentially, I don't know. So, we have to see how that window closes potentially on Israel, and if that impacts Israeli decision-making as they're moving forward.
100%. And this has always been Israel's problem in the age of asymmetrical warfare. It's what I call the invisible enemy. The difference is, though, that the enemy is no longer invisible. In fact, not only is he become very visible, he's torn his mask off. And while I agree with you that we absolutely have to take into account the possibility that the international atmosphere will change as Israel's operation moves forward, and devastation is coming to Gaza. It's already arrived. Going to stay there for a long time. There's no doubt about that. I still think that the international community, or large sections of it, will be more understanding and supportive of Israel's operation than at any time in the past. The extent of the war crime and the genocidal nature of Hamas, its willingness to use genocidal tactics to promote objectives has never been clearer. And therefore, I think, if we look at the hourglass, I think Israel has more time, more space to conduct this operation than it ever has before. And just to give you an example, I'm sure you remember in 2018 and 2019, we had these quote unquote return marches that Hamas had set up. And during that time, they were trying to do exactly what they managed to do this time, which is to send over terrorists across the barrier, albeit in smaller numbers and in a less organized fashion, but send them in and to commit, atrocities in those villages near the Gaza border. And the IDF had set up snipers all along those, that border and killed hundreds of attempted intruders and terrorists and whatnot. And the condemnation of Israel was across the board because the international community simply could not imagine what would happen had the IDF not stopped those intrusions. And now nobody needs to use their imagination. And that's the change. I think that's the change. Now, how long that effect will last, you're absolutely right. We don't know. But it is a change, and I think that's one of the reasons why Israel will have to act very soon.
Now, you talked about the call-ups and the potential for an imminent ground incursion into the Gaza Strip, but we're hearing reports that many soldiers are not being amassed just by the Gaza border, but potentially even a larger number of soldiers have been amassed in the north. And today, there's already been skirmishes along the northern border with Hezbollah. Can you tell me a little bit? Can you review what's happened today along the northern border?
Yeah. So today we had, first of all, projectile fire from school, southern Lebanon, and then we also, I believe, had an anti-tank missile strike from that border, and there was an attempt by a terrorist squad to cross the border into the Western Galilee. Now, that squad was eliminated by the IDF, which suggests that, whoever wants to initiate hostilities from the north is going to run into a highly alert Israel. The element of surprise for the enemy in the north has gone. In terms of the organizational affiliation of who conducted those attacks, we don't yet know. I would remind viewers that Hamas has a presence, has an infrastructure in southern Lebanon. It's been building that for years with the help of the IRGC, the Iranian Islamic Guard Corps, Revolutionary Guard Corps, and Hezbollah is, of course, the dominant terrorist army in southern Lebanon. Now, Israel's response to that was to return fire, first of all, from where the fire came from. And I saw just before coming on the air that Israel also took out a Hezbollah observation tower that had been placed right on the border with Israel under this fake organization called Green Without Borders. It's a so-called environmental agency. It's a Hezbollah outfit that's giving them an excuse to set up military posts because under UN Resolution 1701, they're not supposed to be there. But in the most transparent manner, they are there. So there was a report that a Hezbollah operative was killed in that return fire. We can't confirm that yet. What all of this suggests, if you look at the Israeli deployment as well to the northern border, is that the chance of a northern escalation is very much on the table. I think that we don't know where it's going to go. I think Hezbollah is watching very closely Israel's ability to respond to what's happening in Gaza. And there's a sort of a two-way deterrent effort going on here. On the one hand, I think Hezbollah is trying to deter Israel from eliminating Hamas as an entity. And in the other direction, Israel is informing Lebanon and Hezbollah that the devastation that they're starting to see in Gaza will very quickly arrive in Lebanon if Hezbollah enters this war. That is the message that's being sent from Israel. It's, in my mind, absolutely the right message. It's the only message that Israel can send in this region. It's the only message that could be understood. And also here, this attempt to contain Hezbollah, to allow them to approach the border, to build those posts, and that tent that, was set up and was destroyed, I think, yesterday, early this morning. Now, finally, I think all the right steps are being taken, with sort of this zero tolerance approach, not letting these Islamist and genocidal entities beef up their positions on the border. We've also had an evacuation locally initiated of northern communities. I think that's a wise move because there are question marks about the ability to defend those communities now. So Israel is ready in the north. I think that's the bottom line. Israel is ready. Hezbollah sees that. It cannot surprise Israel in the north. That doesn't mean, by the way, that it can't intrude or kill or harm civilians. Just to be clear, that risk is very much there, but not at the scope, the scale, and the disastrous scenes that we have seen in the south. It's at a knife's edge. It's at a knife's edge.
We've seen already well more than 5,000 rockets fired from Hamas in the south. It's known that Hezbollah is stockpiling as many as 150,000 rockets and missiles in the north, many of them much more sophisticated than the Qassam rockets that Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad fire at Israel from the south. Many of them are long range, can deliver very hefty payloads, some of them precision guided. So if Hezbollah gets into the action, they start firing missiles at Israel. Can Israel expect or hope to have the same type of success in defending against those missiles as they do with the Iron Dome along the southern border?
First of all, no. Unfortunately, Hezbollah's arsenal would, because of the scope of it, and you alluded to the precision-guided missile, which is much bigger threat because that allows Hezbollah to really choose its targets. And, while Hamas looks for city, Hezbollah could go for, strategic sites like a power center or the Knesset or even, if it sees the important figures somewhere, has the ability to do that. This was an ability that was once reserved for great powers to direct munitions to essentially a GPS location, and they can do that. So the threat that they pose to Israel by Hezbollah's arsenal is many times greater than that of Hamas. And Israel's air defenses in that kind of situation would have to prioritize their capabilities to defending Israel's ability to continue to function and return fire and take the war to Hezbollah. So that means defending military bases, power plants, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the general population would have to be much more reliant on alerts, being in safe rooms, and what we call passive defense rather than the active defense of air defenses. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I've heard a lot of military analysis stating that if Israel hopes to protect itself against the majority of the rockets and missiles that Hezbollah is stocking, that it would be imperative to start with a preemptive strike, because once those start firing, you're at a significant disadvantage. So is this the time for Israel to just start with massive air barrage in southern Lebanon before Hezbollah starts firing the rockets at Israel, or is Israel have a different calculation?
Right. So the idea of a preemptive strike is certainly one that, was worth examining, I think, up until a few days ago. But now, because both sides are at their maximal level of operational readiness, you don't think it would have the same element of surprise and therefore advantage that it would have had prior to this escalation. Hezbollah is now very likely in full battle mode. It's in the bunkers, it's prepared. And the advantage of a preemptive strike would be the ability to not only take out its stockpiles of long-range and precision-guided missiles, but also to eliminate many of its senior commanders, its leadership, et cetera, because they would be caught off guard. And I don't think Israel has that advantage now. I think, if Israel has its way, it would prefer to take on one arena at a time, and that would mean being able to focus on the Gaza Strip, focus its military capabilities on that as it begins to recover from this disaster. But it has to be ready for the scenario of a multiple front war. The IDF has been built to enable that to happen. If the general staff is busy with one main front, the other command, in this case, let's say the Northern Command, has to be able to manage an escalation with Hezbollah for an extended period of time until the general staff gets involved in that as well. So the IDF is built from multi-arena conflict. And, if you look back at our history, most conflicts have been multi-arena. The 1967 war and the 1973 Yom Kippur War, where Israel was surprised from two fronts. And, Israel's history is replete with multiple front conflicts. So that's actually not new, but of course the nature of the enemy and the threat is. So yes, Israel can do it. but it would prefer to deal with one arena at a time. And I think the ball is very much in Hezbollah's court here. Israel has signaled that it's not going to return to these days of containing and trying to avoid conflict. The die has been cast. We saw aggressive responses in the north by Israel, I think very rightly so, signaling that the times have changed. Now Hezbollah is going to have to decide whether it's going to bring devastation to Lebanon, like Hamas has brought devastation to Gaza, or whether it's going to live to fight another day.
We talk about the southern front with Hamas. We talk about the northern front with Hezbollah, but there are fronts inside the country as well. There's been ongoing escalating terror in Judea and Samaria, commonly known as the West Bank, both in the northern West Bank and Samaria, places like Jenin, Nablus, Huwara as of recent, and also southern in Judea and Samaria and Judea. And then in addition to that front, you also have, we've seen in the last couple of years, the anger and bubbling among many Arab Israeli citizens in Israeli population centers like Lod, Ramleh, and obviously there's 250,000 Arabs living in Jerusalem and other places. Is the IDF prepared as well to deal with the launch of an intifada by Hamas installations and other rogue terror installations like Lion's Den and Palestinian Islamic Jihad that are inside Judea and Samaria and even inside Israel proper, and also maybe you can address the buildup of automatic weapons in these areas and what that has meant to Israel's ability to stop terror. It's not just stabbings and car rammings anymore. Now they have large caches of automatic weapons going around.
Automatic weapons and IEDs. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I mean, Judea and Samaria was the dominant arena up until this horrific assault began, and that's where the lion's share of the IDF's active duty battalions were. Obviously, that's going to change now. So when we're looking at the allocation of forces, the IDF has sent some of its battalions into Israel to deal with the potential threats of what we saw happening in 2021 in Operation Guardian of the Walls. It is, of course, going to retain a significant presence across Judea and Samaria to ensure that the communities there are not overrun and that the roads don't become, scenes of carnage and terrorist attacks. So that's the balancing act that it's going to have to play. And the role of reservists is going to be critical, because once the IDF, and it has, as you've said, hauled up its reserves, then it has the ability to deal with these arenas simultaneously. It's not something that can be done only with a conscripted standing army. So these reserves are now in motion, and they're being divided along the north, in Samaria, within Israel, within Gaza Strip. Israel was also in the process of setting up a domestic force, a National Guard. Unfortunately, it's still very much at the beginning of this process, but there was a welcome and long overdue effort to build a National Guard, and that would have been the job of the National Guard. Is you can bring in thousands of these well-trained officers. Some of them would be border police, some of them would be reservists, some of them would be volunteers, and send them to the trouble spots if necessary. And that's, the force exists, but it's still at an initial phase, so it's only going to be part of Israel's response. It's going to be a combined military and police response. And yeah, absolutely. The IDF, its operations branch, the Israel police, they're going to be allocating these forces based on the threat assessment, but the focus is going to be the Gaza Strip. As long as Israel can focus on Gaza, it's going to focus on Gaza, and that's why we have 4 divisions on the border with Gaza.
Is there any risk of violence erupting along the Syrian border?
Absolutely. The Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah, particularly Hezbollah, and the Iranians themselves have a presence in Syria. The good news here, however, is that unlike Lebanon, unlike Gaza, Israel has been very active in the past 10 years, preventing the construction of a terrorist army in Syria. Iran very much wanted to build a second Hezbollah, and Israel, through this campaign that's called the campaign between the wars, or it's a gray zone operation, or a shadow war, however people want to call it, has prevented approximately, let's say, 70% of those capabilities from reaching Syria, from being used to build an army in Syria, an Iranian orchestrated army. So the Syrian arena is much more limited, but certainly we have to be on the lookout for aggression from Syria too. No question about it.
You talk about Iran, and obviously whenever you're talking about security in Israel, it seems as though Hamas, Hezbollah, Syria, it all ties back to Iran. And, we've seen Iran just march closer and closer to becoming a nuclear power. Prime Minister Netanyahu has stated that his number one objective as Prime Minister of Israel has been to prevent Iran from crossing the nuclear threshold. At the same time, Iran just continues to get closer and closer to the nuclear threshold. Are we potentially at a moment where Israel might open up yet another front with its Air Force and potentially launch strikes directly at Iran's nuclear facilities?
Look, when the Air Force, trains and builds up its force, it absolutely builds itself for this eventuality, multiple arena. Keep coming back to that. And that is, what Iran has built around Israel. It's built a multi-arena threat. And the Iranian homeland, what we call the Far Eastern arena in the regional context, is going to be a major zone that the Air Force is going to want to be able to deal with. But there's a big difference between building capabilities and activating them. And I think that at this stage, if Iran stays out of the war, and we saw, the deployment of a U.S. carrier group into the Mediterranean, I interpret that as a direct message of deterrence by U.S. CENTCOM, the man that's responsible for the Middle East, telling Iran, listen, we have Israel's back here. I think that's the military message that was being sent. And if you get involved, you're going to have to deal with us. That's the message that's being sent as far as I can understand. So if Iran doesn't get directly involved in this war in Gaza Strip, I think Israel will not strike it now, will not initiate a new front. Because, frankly, Israel has a lot of work ahead of it. A very painful period not only precedes us, but is also waiting for us. And if Israel is able to focus on Gaza, I think it will do that. But again, the ball is in the court of Iran. If it chooses to launch missiles, and it has the Middle East's largest missile array on Iranian territory, if it chooses to get involved directly, then of course Israel will retaliate in kind. I also would point out that Iran, its whole doctrine is building this ring of fire around Israel, and this ties the dots to everything that we've been talking about. The weapons that are coming into Judea and Samaria, the IEDs, the machine guns, a lot of those are Iranian smuggled over the Jordanian border. Who funded Hamas? Who funds all of Palestinian Islamic Jihad? It's Iran. More than $100 million a year, probably more now. That assessment is a few years old, but probably even more. It's Iranian funded. The doctrines are from Iran. The know-how is from Iran. Everything that we're dealing with, Gaza, in Lebanon, Judea, Samaria, has an Iranian fingerprint. They want to build this circle of fire around us without having to deal with us directly.
So when you talk about creating a new Middle East or changing the paradigm in the Middle East, how do you do that if you don't cut off the so-called head of the snake? If you would take out somehow the regime in Iran or make them no longer a nuclear threat, wouldn't that have an effect, a positive effect on all these other arenas?
Oh, it absolutely would. But the thing is, I don't believe that we have the ability to destroy the Iranian regime with military power. It's too large. It's too far. I think Israel has the ability to strike Iranian nuclear sites if they cross a further threshold. It has the ability to strike regime sites, but to actually destroy the regime, I don't believe that that's in our military power. But, the question that you ask is a good one. What's the order that we should do this in? And I think, because of what has happened, it's already been chosen. The order will be to cut off Iran's tentacles in the region. And the first tentacle that's going to be cut off is the one in the Gaza Strip. And that has actually been the most active Iranian-backed terrorist army. It's been the least stable. It's been the one that's the first, to escalate, whether it's Palestinian Islamic Jihad and now Hamas. It's always been the one that Iran could rely on to escalate when its interests are at stake. And we can get around to talking about why this happened now. I have a few suspicions about that as well. I think the Saudi-Israeli normalization is a big part of this. But in any case, if we go after the tentacles of Iran before the head of the beast, that is also an acceptable way to deal with the threat, in my view.
We've seen a growing relationship, and maybe a disturbing growing relationship, between Iran and Russia. For a long time in Syria, Russia and Iran were sort of holding each other at bay, so to speak. But we've seen in the last period, Iranian provision of weapons to Russia in its war against Ukraine, and potentially, Israel's choosing to side a little bit more with Ukraine in the battle, in their war against Russia, has sort of maybe changed the Russian calculus a little bit. Just today, I think there was a statement from the Kremlin saying that it's very likely that a third party would get involved in this war. Is there some type of calculation here regarding Russia and its involvement, and does that change any of the thinking?
So, Russia's regional involvement is really all about Syria. That's where it's chosen to reestablish itself, rescue the Assad regime. And for a while, there was some kind of competition between Russia and Iran, even though they were fighting on the same side on behalf of the Assad regime. There was also tension over who would end up controlling post-war Syria. Now that has changed very much, because what has happened is that Iran has become the principal supplier of a large part of Russia's firepower. So, we're talking about over 1,000 UAVs, suicide UAVs, that have been fired by Russians, made in Iran. And practically overnight, the Iranians have built a UAV production facility on Russian soil. The Iranians are trying to get ballistic missiles into Russia's depots so that they can fire them at Ukrainian cities. So we're seeing Iranian firepower being deployed in Eastern Europe. And that changes everything, because it means that Russia is dependent on Iran. It owes Iran. And I think that really changes Russia's position in the region and the way Israel looks at Russia. Russia is going to have to repay this debt. And how that happens, we don't yet know. There's been talk of transferring fighter jets. That's one option. But even more immediately, the Russians could help the Iranians with their nuclear sites. They have that know-how. They could help them with satellites, with missiles, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a new level of relationship and codependency between Iran and Russia. It's a negative event, clearly, but on the other hand, it also brings into focus the fact that, the American presence in the Middle East is going to have to be reviewed, I think, by the United States, and it has been reviewed already, that they can't just simply minimize their presence in the Middle East and let Russia and China move into the region and wish America's allies the best of luck. I think that is beginning to change, certainly in the Pentagon and in U.S. CENTCOM. It's been clear for a while that needs to change. Whether that understanding is going up the chain of command into the White House, I believe that, the message has been sent, and we're going to see a different kind of U.S. posture in the region. And it ties into these greater strategic questions. The superpowers are back in this region competing with each other, and that certainly affects Israel. Hamas doesn't have any direct ties or important ties with Iran. With Russia. It's been an intensive few days here, as you can imagine. But it doesn't have any direct or important ties. It's really all about Iran. Iran is its benefactor, its sponsor, its supplier, etc. But Iran is part of this emerging bloc with Russia, and that certainly has global implications.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground, as we do every day at JNS. You can definitely catch Yaakov Lappin's analysis and reporting at jns.org on an almost daily basis, especially now during the conflict. We've been updating reports around the clock, providing analysis, not just on our website and our daily newsletter, which I urge everybody to subscribe to. We're sending out both morning and evening editions with continuous updates. We're also posting regularly on every social media channel out there, including YouTube. These analyses that we've been doing almost daily have been getting tens of thousands of views each time on YouTube. So we appreciate that. And I would also just like to say to those that are watching this and are regularly consuming JNS articles, reporting, and analysis, is that we are, in fact, a reader-supported news agency. We are a 501c3 U.S. non-for-profit news and media agency. We don't do this for money. We're doing this to get the articles and the good information out there. We are fighting the narrative warfare that takes place alongside the physical warfare battles that are playing out in real life. And so if you do appreciate what we're doing, as I said, please like us on every channel. Please subscribe to our daily newsletter. Please come to jns.org first for information, and also please do consider making a tax-deductible contribution. You can see the donation links on our website at jns.org. One-time and recurring monthly contributions go a long way to helping us continuously improve our coverage, and also to greatly increase our reach, which has just continued to grow, over the last period of months and years. So we do appreciate your support. I want to thank you, Yaakov, for coming on and joining us today. And I'm sure that in the coming days and weeks, we'll be coming back to you for more analysis. I must say, I'm so impressed with the breadth of knowledge and the details that you're able to provide. I think it's a tremendous service to our readers and to the viewers of this webinar, which will also be on YouTube in the coming hours. So thank you, and thank you to all of the viewers. And
thank you very much.
We'll see you soon. Thank you.